Welcome back, everyone. This video will be the second part of Chapter 1, which will talk about the mass communication models that we use and how we think about mass communication in different types of structures. So we talked about that media and communication are critical parts of how we understand culture and society. But we should recognize that there are various eras of communication, that at different times, communication meant different things to America. We also need to look at media innovation and how new media comes about, and also the convergence media model, which allows different types of media to bleed into one another. Then we'll talk about different ways of understanding mass communication through models, such as communication as skyscraper, communication as map, and the cultural values model. So, as we talked about, mass media are channels to distribute cultural messages to large groups of people. So, the phases of communication go from oral and written forms of communication, which don't typically reach a large group of people, to print, electronic, and digital, which the last three bring us into eras of mass communication because it allows us to talk to large groups of people and thus distribute cultural messages further into society. Now, the oral and written eras of communication are really the first communication types. As we've talked about before, philosophers like Aristotle and Plato tried to ban poets who were trying to discourage public discourse because they feared that writing would take away from oral communication and its impact. Early writing was only for the very educated and powerful groups, which meant it was also very slow and there wasn't much audience for it. You were pretty much talking to people exactly like you. So we think about the ways that aspects of our culture cheapen public discussion and discourage face-to-face communication. For instance, in thinking about the presidential debates, a lot of people were saying that presidential debates should no longer happen because the way that we communicate now isn't the same as when we had presidential debates in the past, and the public discourse has been cheapened by it. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think that once further restrictions were put in place and things were moderated a little better, the public discourse was able to flourish a little bit more. But we also hear so often that forms of mass media discourage face-to-face communication, that you grew up in an era of texting on cell phones or writing on message boards and things like that, as opposed to having face-to-face communication. However, research really shows that that's not necessarily true, that there may be some aspects of face-to-face communication that are dampened, but overall, mass communication impacts us, but doesn't necessarily cheapen other types of communication. However, that is up for debate. So you need to make your own opinion on whether you are able to speak and write like you should need to be as a professional based on how much you use mass communication. Now, the print era, as I said before, really begins the first mass communication era. Gutenberg's printing press in the mid 1400s really brought us to an era of being able to distribute messages on a larger scale. We had books, which were the first mass marketed products, which allowed for machine duplication because of the printing press that was fast and cheap. And once we have the Industrial Revolution, we're creating national identities that allow for individualism, where the individual person becomes more important as opposed to just some worker on a line, right? And so we have copies of the Federalist Papers, for instance, that are distributed in America to talk about what a constitution would really look like. And it's not just for the political elite. It's not just for the rich. Instead, we have these writings that can be accessed by all Americans and really create this democracy of culture and allow us to have more individual input on larger social issues. Now, the electronic era is really defined by having signals that go out. The first electronic era starts in the 1840s with the telegraph, and there were four key contributions that the telegraph made. The first was that it was not bound by distance. For instance, you could get a message all the way from New York to California, and that was not a problem, where a letter traveling that distance probably wouldn't make it. It also made it a commodity, which made the telegraph industry a business. It allowed for coordination between military, between businesses, and it really allowed a lot of industrial growth within America because of these long range signals. It also was the grandfather of future technologies like radio and television. And so the telegraph really signals in, no pun intended, signals in the electronic era, but the electronic era is really defined by the boom of television in the 1950s and 60s. The digital era is when we begin to use binary signals, in other words, ones and zeros for computer language, to reassemble messages. The digital era includes cable TV, internet, social media, and now even emerging medias like 360, AR, and VR. And the digital era completely upended traditional business and media models to allow for the growth of business, but also changing the way that we do business and really society as a whole. Now, there are many factors that influence mass communication and mass media, what is considered acceptable and what is not. And they really range on four broad spectrums. The first is social, meaning what is going on in society and what is considered socially acceptable and not. The second is cultural, and a lot of this can be what influences on our culture are there. So, do we have a culture that values individualism or groups? Do we have a culture that wants freedom of speech, or do we want everything to be controlled? Um, Political is the influence of politics and government on mass media. And then, of course, we have economic control and influence over mass media. And this is the business and industry's influence over these communication types. Now, media innovation means new media. So we have seen how media and technology have transformed and changed at a very, very rapid pace. When I was your age, I was still using floppy disks. I know I'm old, but hey, Oregon Trail was always the best on floppy, okay? But media innovation talks about how new technology and how new types of media come about. And the first step of media innovation is the emergence or novelty. This is the problem solving stage. How do we get from having these disks that you have to print out that are kind of burdensome that you have to install? Well, how do we solve that problem? Okay, well, maybe we can install an application, but it doesn't have to require a disk. How could we do that, right? And so we innovate to using apps. The second step of media innovation is entrepreneurial, which means the practical or marketable use. Does it make sense money-wise to start doing this? Why would it make more sense to download an app on your phone than to print a CD? Well, guess what? Apps are a lot cheaper to produce than CDs. So there is entrepreneurial reason for this technology to continue. The third is that you're able to make it a mass medium. You can sell it to consumers. Having CDs would not be effective if computers were not able to have a CD-ROM, right? A place where you could put in the CD and use it. The same would be true if we didn't have the App Store or Google Store. If there was no place to sell it to customers or no way for customers to get it, it wouldn't be an innovative media type because no one would use it. And then the fourth step of media innovation is convergence. It means that it takes what is existing media and merges with it to become this whole new thing. So, for instance, we merge television with digital technologies and we get streaming services, and that's a convergent type of media. So we also have the diffusion of innovation model, which talks about how some media technologies are able to last a really long time and how others aren't. So what makes Netflix popular versus Hulu or any other dying type of media innovation? Why is Facebook considered now old while TikTok is considered innovative? And that really comes out to how it diffuses among society, how it spreads out. So the innovators are those people that use the new technology very early on. They're those key influencers that we talked about earlier. They're the people that try something out when it is still brand new and no one knows about it, and then they influence other people to use it. And the second stage is those early adopters. And the early adopters will still be those people that are kind of on the cusp of using this new technology. Um, so for instance, with Harry Potter, my friend was really an innovator. She was probably one of like the first 1,000 people to read Harry Potter. That's not even a lie. And then I was among early adopters because I read it before book 2 even came out, right? But then there was this really large gap in the Harry Potter books, for instance, between people who wanted to read it from book 1 until it became this national phenomena around book 3 and 4. There was a gap in who wanted to read. But once we hit books 3 and 4, for instance, there was this early majority of people where it suddenly became cool to read Harry Potter, right? And then you have those late majority people who are like, I'll read it because everybody says it's good and I've heard they're great, but we're already through, 7 books at this point. We've got other different plays and, the Hogwarts library and everything that's already come out. So those are the people who are late majority. Then you have the laggards who are like, no, I don't want to change at all. And my husband would be an example of a laggard with Harry Potter because he just doesn't interact with it at all. But you can see how different technologies go through this as well. Think about cell phones, for instance, and you have people who adopted the iPhone very early that were mainly tech marvels. Then you have very early adopters, so some consumers that thought it was really cool, but it takes a while for the iPhone to catch on. Then you get a large group of people who get the iPhone, and then you have like your grandparents who didn't get the iPhone until you bought it for them at Christmas, and they're still trying to figure out how to FaceTime, and they FaceTime their ear because they're holding it up to their ear instead of to their face, those kinds of things. And then you have those people who are still using flip phones, like my father-in-law. So you can see how different media innovate at different paces, but they all follow that same pattern of diffusion of innovation. Now, convergence is a term that we use a lot in mass communication, but it has 2 different meanings. The first meaning of convergence is the one that I use most often, and it means the merging of content in different mass media. So we first have oral communication, but we take oral communication with letters and then digital technology, and we combine them all together to get email, right? Or we have print newspapers that are printed in black and white ink, right, on actual paper and delivered. You combine those with internet websites and you get digital news. These are examples of convergent media practice, meaning that you take one existing type of media and you form it into a new type of media by combining them. You have Blockbuster, which sells, first VHS tapes, and then you have DVDs, and then you have Blu-rays. Then you have Netflix DVD, which will actually mail you these DVDs to your home. That actually still exists. I had no idea until I was putting this together. And then you get to streaming services where you don't even have to have the disc. So you can see how media continues to innovate through the use of convergence. Now, a secondary meaning of convergence, which is also popular to use in mass communication, is combining of media holdings. And this really talks about who owns media organizations. For instance, ABC is not just a network, but it also owns ESPN, it owns, Disney, and all these different types of things. Actually, Disney owns ABC. I said that backwards. But you can see that this one organization, Disney, owns many different types of media holdings. Well, the good thing about that is that they have a lot of resources, which means they can create these epic series like The Mandalorian because they have the finances to do it. It means that they have management and profits that allow them to continue. But the con of having convergence, where there are fewer and fewer owners within the media landscape, means that there are fewer and fewer perspectives being delivered. Unless management in those ownerships allows for minority voices. So, for instance, Netflix now has a really big value on telling diverse stories. And so we might see more perspective, although, the reality is that the perspective will mainly be who looks like the owners, who are predominantly white males. And so we can see that convergence in media in terms of organization ownership can have a large impact on the messages that we see as well. So, is mass communication really consumed in masses? This has been changing a lot in recent years. We have media multitasking, which means that we are often doing things while consuming other types of media. For instance, I love listening to audiobooks while I'm getting ready in the morning. So I'm not really focused on what I'm listening to. It's just kind of on in the background. Or you might listen to music while you're driving, or listen to NPR radio while you're driving. You may watch the football game while also on Twitter. You may watch a presidential debate while doing live tweets and reactions to it on your social media profiles. This is called second screening, when we're really consuming two different types of media at the same time. And a lot of times this deals with us using our phones while also doing, TV or on the internet. But second screening can be any time that you're using two types of media at once. We tend to use 10 and 3/4 hours of media in 7.5 hours. So we are consuming more media than we actually have time for. And this is due to second screening. And so this tells us that, mass communication is really having to compete with itself. And we have to understand that the masses aren't always paying attention fully to what they're viewing. Now, in order to understand media culture, it's important to understand different perspectives of what media truly is. And there are three main types of organization of media culture. The first is culture as a skyscraper. And this is what we think of as having high and low culture. For instance, things that would be considered things that rich people do, or things that cultured people do, and I put quotation marks around cultured, would be poetry or jazz, ballet, opera, Shakespeare. Those are items of high culture because they are deemed to have high cultural importance by society. We have mid culture within the skyscraper model. This would be things that combine high culture and low culture together. And so that could be something like Downton Abbey, which appears on PBS and has a lot of historical context. It's written, for an educated audience, and yet it has entertainment value. The same for most news outlets. CNN is given here as an example of mid-culture. A lot of music would be considered mid-culture. But then we have low culture, and this is your, drudge of society when looking at the skyscraper model, right? It's the 50 Shades of Grey romance novel smut that you see at CVS, for instance. And I don't actually think these things. This is just the view of culture as skyscraper. It's viewing The Bachelor as, being the drudges of society. Now, don't get me wrong, I love The Bachelor, and I watch it all the time. But, that would be considered low culture within the skyscraper model. So when you're thinking about the skyscraper model of media culture, you want to think that there are things that are very high up and very cultural and artistic and meaningful. And then there are the Kardashians down at the bottom. Now, in viewing culture as a skyscraper model, there are lots of concerns about the impact of low culture on society. So, the people that hold culture as a skyscraper model think that high culture allows you to appreciate art. It allows you to grow as a person. And low culture, on the other hand, does not allow you to appreciate these things. It takes away your time from them. It exploits art and culture. For instance, The Munsters, which was a very popular television show about the monster Frankenstein and his bride and family, that would be considered an exploitation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein novel because it takes something that is fine art and makes it, daytime comedy kind of things. There's also this idea that there's a throwaway ethic in low culture, that we consume something very rapidly and then throw it away as if it did not matter. For instance, I just binge watched Bridgerton within like 2 days, right? Well, I may never watch it again. So now I've thrown it out of my life and it has no impact, according to this view of skyscraper culture. They also suggest that low culture dulls our cultural taste buds, that we can't tell the difference between Beethoven, classical music versus Maroon 5, that everything begins to taste like a Big Mac, for instance. And it just dulls our taste buds for what is truly great art. And then I think the main concern that high culture people have in viewing this skyscraper model is that people who spend their time on low culture items diminishes the audience for high culture. And that's why we've seen a decreased turnout for museums or for theater or art galleries. And so these are the arguments of why low culture is bad for us, according to the skyscraper model. However, not everybody believes this. Sleeper Curve was a study and then book written by Stephen Johnson. The name of the book is Everything Bad is Good for You. And it was really a rebuttal for popular culture, for pop culture, what would be considered those mid to low levels of culture. And it was saying that by growing the complexity of popular culture, we increase our intellectual abilities. So I think about The Crown, for instance, where I've learned so much about Queen Elizabeth II because of that series. So I am growing in my knowledge and my intellectual ability by watching The Crown, even though that would really be considered popular culture to those who would only consider art and theater to be high culture. So the sleeper curve idea is that we can still learn and grow from mid and low culture range. I have this screenshot on the slide of Reading Rabbit. And my dad always jokes that I actually learned how to read through computer games like Reader Rabbit because they help teach me, vocabulary and phonics skills that I would have had to go to books for prior to computers. And so not all pop culture is bad, is the argument of the sleeper curve. So we get things like the Hunger Games series, for instance, that are mid-range in culture, but they teach us things. They talk about deeper issues, incivility. What does it look like when a government tries to overthrow its people? What happens when we stand up to a government in power? And they talk about these large social and cultural issues, and then those become defining moments for our society and culture through the use of these pop culture mediums. Now, culture as a map is the second type of model that we think about for media culture. And culture as a map allows for individual taste. It says that we spread out in different directions, not just vertically. So we can appreciate Beethoven while also appreciating Bay, and we don't necessarily think of one as better than the other. And so the culture as a map model really allows us to feel connected to all different forms of media and feel like we are gaining things from each in different ways. So, for instance, I read a lot of children's books because I have a 6-year-old. I still feel like I learn from those just as much as I do from Shakespeare in some ways. My online social networks can be an absolute, dumpster fire at times, but at other times it helps connect me with communities that I would have never talked to before. There are Hollywood films that impact me in huge psychological and emotional ways, just the same way that listening to a classical music piece does. So, culture as a map really allows us to blend high and low culture and view them all as equal. Now, there are a few defining things about culture as a map, and these are really the landmarks within the map, if you're thinking about it as like an actual physical map that you read. We often find landmarks in our individual taste that are comforts of familiar things. So, if you've ever wondered why Disney is remaking all of the classic stories into live action films, it's because we consider them landmark moments in our life. And so, we want to come back to familiar stories like Beauty and the Beast or Aladdin and watch them in a new way. And so culture as a map also drives forth innovation and the attraction of the new. So we like things that are new. When you're thinking and looking at a map, do you want to go back to the same places or do you want to explore what you haven't explored before? Culture as a map would say that the new and the innovative is really interesting to us. There are also a range of maps and messages to partake from. So just because I love Disney doesn't mean that the next person's map will also have Disney. So it comes down to individual preferences. And there's also this idea that within culture as a map, we have to challenge these nostalgic items that are not meeting up with our social and societal expectations now to create a better past. So, for instance, if we look back at Peter Pan, for instance, that has references to Indians instead of Native Americans. Well, how can we, within our culture as a map, kind of resolve that? And where do we move forward with that? Do we change the original? Do we make it new? Do we put a warning label on it? And so, culture as a map really allows us to challenge those nostalgic moments that we long for, that are familiar to us, and make it so that we are okay to move forward with those items. So, the third type of organization system for media culture is the value system. And the value system runs pretty parallel to the eras of communication that we talked about at the beginning of lecture. The first cultural value that we see runs from the Industrial Revolution, when we see the birth of mass communication, to the mid 20th century. The cultural values at this time period are efficiency, just the facts, ma'am, as Dragnet always says. Form follows function, meaning that you get the information in whatever way that you can get it. So it's why we were okay with only having a handful of newspapers, you know, those types of things. But the Industrial Revolution really begins to celebrate individuals, new ideas, and self expression. But we believe that those come within a rational order that we are still within the framework of an educated society. But we are beginning in this time period to reject tradition and embrace progress. So we want social reforms that you see in the 60s and 70s, the civil rights era, things like that. And we are wanting change, but it still needs to be within that structured, rational order. So those are some of the defining cultural values for that time period, where our current time period, the mid 20th century to present, really deals with populism, which heavily blurs the lines between high and low culture. It also involves diversifying and recycling cultural content. So you may notice that we have series from the 60s that are being repurposed in the 90s, and then we get a new Charlie's Angels, within the last few years. Same thing with, ancient stories of the Mulan warrior in Chinese culture, which has been made into a cartoon movie, which is then made into a live action film. This is because we like to recycle culture, and it's actually a cultural value that we have presently. But an important part of this is that as we become more diverse within our culture and as we become more open as a society, we then want to diversify that content as well. And so Peter Parker moves from always being white to now having a Black Peter Parker, having, um, you know, um, Black Panther and Wakanda as a celebrated superhero within our culture. So these are taking the same cultural messages that we know and love, but diversifying them for the better. And then we also have a cultural value currently of questioning science, that there is no single truth, but instead there are many truths. So I can believe one thing, you can believe another as true. And we just agree that we're both right and no one else is wrong. Or we might say the other person's wrong, but we don't force them to hold our truth. And then there is also this reverence of nostalgia, which we've talked about before, where we want to continue to recycle content and come back to things that we know and love from our childhoods. So in this postmodern era of cultural value, we see a willingness to accept the paradox of integrating retro belief systems with contemporary culture. And this is about how we see some change, but not tons of progress, because we keep coming back to the past, but then we also want to reinvent it just a little bit. So this kind of slows the progression of cultural values within the postmodern era, and something that we are continuing to see growth and change in. So if you have any questions about the Chapter 1 lectures, please feel free to contact me at any time. I'm always here and want to hear from you guys. Please make sure that you have done your discussion post. And after you complete your discussion post, prep for next week by reading Chapter 2. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a wonderful week.